The next speaker is someone with whom SJI has been working for some time now. And he is very dear to me because he made me cry the very first time I heard him speak about the topic of adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma. The stories he shared about the impact of adverse childhood experiences and trauma on real people broke me wide open. But he didn't leave me there. He also talked about resilience. He talked about hope for what could happen if we learned more about complex trauma and more about ourselves. I was profoundly moved. Blodgett. He helped me understand what it really means to change the question, what is wrong with you, to what happened to you? So I give you a scholar, a gentleman, and my personal heartbreaker, Blodgett.
Well, good morning, everybody. I actually resisted John Kim for over 6 months as he pounded on me to come work with him at Seattle Jobs Initiative.
It's true!
The man is unrelenting. But I'll tell you why it is that we took the step into this issue of, is there such a thing as trauma-informed workforce development? And what John persuaded me is that with our focus that's been in early learning in K-12 and how do we build more compassionate and compelling kinds of systems, that the people that you work with often are there because the education system was not the right system for them, did not prepare them in the way that they needed to be prepared, and often come with exactly the same kinds of histories that we're seeing as being so dominant in the lives of children, and it just continues on into adulthood. I had a practical experience with the issue of bad design leading to scarcity when I went over the next building to go to the bathroom. And I walked directly into the door through a line of 10 women who were waiting to go use the restroom. So, and actually my comment as I breezed through was, "This ain't just." And I'll stand by that statement. When I'm done, we're going to roll you into about an hour-long workshop, and you're going to have a lot of opportunity to talk to each other. And what we're hoping to do is we're going to put some ideas together for you that you're going to work with. But the emphasis is on work. So in the process of doing this, I need to tell you, I'm going to give you a couple of hints after having listened to Eldar. But I think that it's just scratching surface of points of connection. So here are the things that I was writing down. The meaning that we create matters in terms of how we understand scarcity. Context matters, the relationship and the environment we're in. I'm going to argue with you that trauma can be thought of as a source of scarcity, and that compassion and validation changes context and creates hope. So I'm going to just do a quick show of hands in the room. How many of you feel that you're pretty familiar with this whole idea of adverse childhood experiences? If I could just see hands. You're a much more literate group than I usually talk to. I'm going to end up going back through that because that was about 40–50% of the room, and for others this is still relatively new information, which is indeed where we seem to be. So this is one of the least well-known drivers of public policy right now in the United States. So this is front and center in National Institutes of Health. Department of Education is beginning to utilize these ideas a lot more significantly. Major investors from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to Robert Wood Johnson to federal programs are beginning to use these concepts as pretty much backbone concepts as we're dealing with these issues. And what I want to start with is that we have to expand how we talk about what puts people at risk. So we've had about a 45–50 year conversation in the United States about the issue of child maltreatment. And most of us in this room have grown up with this as a given, something that we just assumed is part of how it is, that we draw a line about what can happen in families and when this becomes an issue of public concern. And we've made assumptions about not necessarily the perfection of what it is that we have in this system, but the importance of this system in the lives of our communities. So these 4 issues of sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect have been something that has been framing how we think about how we operate as communities, how we view ourselves as professionals in the work that we do. The idea of adverse childhood experiences is certainly to hold on to these 4, but we have to begin to expand the conversation. So we need to think about the impact of separation and divorce on children. Domestic violence, caregiver mental health problems, caregiver substance abuse, incarceration in a family. Right there, I just gave you what is kind of classically referred to as adverse childhood experiences. This is the list of 9 questions that were the backbone of the original study. This is now a peer-reviewed journal, literature of nearly 700 articles. What I'm going to be summarizing for you has been demonstrated cross-culturally in sub-Saharan Africa, in Australia, in Asia, as well as here in North America. But we need to add some things because we can't get stuck on the specifics, because it's actually the process of accommodation that's far, far more important to understand these issues. And I'm just going to hit 3 that I think are highly relevant to many of our communities. First one is community violence. We end up seeing many communities having to deal with this as just part of the fundamental context. Interestingly, I live in Spokane, and having conversations with this, actually with colleagues that are in the room, the comment was that it's not that we don't have community violence in Spokane, but it's not very visible, and it doesn't get reported on a routine basis. Other communities like Oakland, where we're having the opportunity to work, in California, it's a dominating issue that we end up having to deal with. Homelessness and racism and historical trauma. So as we look at these issues, the list could go on, and the list in some ways becomes significantly personal in terms of what the implications are. But it's the process of accommodation to growing up where this is a chronic and continuing part of your life. So think of the first 9 when I go to the next slide, talking about the ACEs study. So I'll start using the acronym ACEs. This begins early in 1990s. It begins in San Diego with a major study that is still ongoing. So this is a study that is still actively following families. They ended up recruiting over 17,000 adults into this as a study, and these were adults that were enrolled in the Kaiser Permanente health plan. So these are middle-class, predominantly white people that are coming through the door on this particular study. When they came in, the request was, would you be willing to volunteer for a study? What we'd like to do is ask you some questions about what it was like when you were growing up. We'd like to be able to have access to your health records, and we'd like to stay in touch with you to see how life goes. So those were the 3 principal asks that were in this particular study. The questions about growing up in childhood that they asked were simple yes/no questions. So I'm going to take you back to the previous slide, and I'm going to have you do a little self-assessment, because you may have already been doing it because this is just naturally what we do when we're faced with these things. Well, let me tell you, one of the things, I had a horrifying conversation at the beginning of today about somebody going to a workshop where people were all but asked to shout out what their adversities were when they were children. It's terrifying. The issue is we need to hold this information with care and with knowledge. It's not a badge of honor or dishonor. It is part of who we are as people, but it needs to be treated with care as we deal with these issues. So this is a very private issue. So emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, separation, divorce, domestic violence, caregiver mental health, caregiver substance abuse, incarceration in the family. So the way you score that is that if you said, yes, that was actually one of those things was part of my life, you give yourself a 1, and you just start counting. Okay, so that's how you get to an ACE score as you deal with these issues. So here's what they found. Very few of us actually ask this question will end up saying that none of those things happened to us. It's about a third. And that's over here. So you see with no reported ACEs on the left-hand column, that's the original ACE study. The right column is household surveys done with about 50,000 households here in Washington State over the last several years in CDC surveys that are done on an annual basis. What we end up seeing is that a conservative count is that about 1 in 4 of us grow up in situations where we end up having 3 or more of those adversities were true about our childhood. And what we end up seeing is that when we get up at 3 and 4 ACEs, the early childhood experiences end up having profound health impacts. And this is not exclusively, but it's principally a health outcome study that has been being conducted. So what we end up seeing with 4 or more ACEs is that we have 4 to 12 times the rate of behavioral health problems. And it depends on what we're looking at. And this includes depression and suicide attempt, drug abuse, alcoholism. 2 to 4 times increased rate of poor self-reported health as adults. And critically, 3 to 4 times increased risk of development of chronic illness, and specifically heart disease and liver disease. Now, the issue about heart disease, I want to just focus on that for a second, because it is still the #1 killer of people in the United States. But as somebody who spent most of my life working with the issue of the role that violence plays in the lives of children and their families, this to me was profound as this began to hit the literature in the late 1990s. Because the situation when we talk about trauma, much like when we talk about poverty, what we end up saying is that that's that problem of those people over there, that this is not us. And indeed what the ACEs study says is that this is us, that we swim in adversity, that this is a common characteristic of any of our communities that we end up living in, that is largely detached from the issue of income, that this is something that crosses racial barriers routinely. I'll come back on that point because with Eldar's introduction of the issue of poverty, I am going to speak to that and its relationship here about what I think we know at this point, although I'll tell you it's a pretty active area of debate. And the concept is the ACE dose. So as ACEs increase, risk increases, and it increases in a pretty stepwise kind of an approach with this. So in the original study, it's 1 in 4. A better estimate, in my opinion, is actually more like 1 in 3. And when we start going into low-income communities and disenfranchised communities, we're probably looking more on the order of 1 in 2 in terms of rates of exposure, in terms of high ACEs. So we end up seeing that this became the starting point of a fundamental shift. So as we look at the social determinants of health, a pretty compelling case can be made that ACEs are the single most predictive thing that we can know about somebody's risk in terms of their health status. This is work that was done with the Washington data that I was referencing before, and I'm not going to read it to you, but the big ink stain in the middle of this blot is the percent of these health problems that are explained by understanding the ACE history of people. And the term is called population attributable risk. So population attributable risk in public health is the idea that if I know this one thing, after controlling for others, how powerful is it as an explanatory tool? So just really quickly up in the upper left, nearly 60% of HIV high-risk sexual behavior can be explained by understanding ACE history. Anxiety disorders, it's 56%. And again, I won't keep reading that around. But one of the things that we're learning is that if we lower ACEs, we reliably can decrease all of these conditions simultaneously in communities. So the challenge that we have in our communities is actually we do not have much of a conversation going on about adversity and the resulting trauma. This is something that is still outside of the line of much of the communications that we have inside our communities. So this is a study that was done in 2012. It's done by a man named David Finkelhor and his team. He's a very well-known criminal justice researcher. This is, again, a household survey of about 5,000 households across the United States. And the question that they were interested in was the issue of violence exposure in children under the age of 18. And they were using a criminal justice lens. So more often than not, what they were asking about, if it was brought to the attention of police, it would have led to an arrest. So these are pretty significant kinds of concerns. The first thing that's not on the slide is that they confirm something that we've known for a while, which is that violence is just common, just routine. So 6 out of 10 of the children in the study reported that they had been a victim of at least one violent act in the previous 12 months. 6 out of 10. Now, again, we've known that for a long time. But what they then asked that makes this, I think, a really important study is they said, did anybody in a position of authority know that it happened to you? And it was less than half said yes. They then went on and they said, from the list that we're going to give you, who knew? And that little tiny slice at 3%, that's primary health care. The 23%, that's law enforcement. And the 74%, that's schools. That's people who are in day-to-day contact. So the work that I want to talk to you about is why this is our conversation, that this is not something that we can hand to others to end up dealing with this, that every one of us ends up being in the trauma business, that we don't have a choice about that because this is the reality of how it is that we live in many of our communities. We've been doing a series of studies, but we're primarily an intervention group, so I'll pause for a moment and talk about the work we do. For the last 10 years, what we've been very interested in is can we translate the ideas of trauma about best practice principles into non-therapeutic settings? Because if it's 1 in 3 of us that ended up growing up with this kind of risk being described, this is not something that treatment systems can handle by themselves. This is actually a public health crisis. So that as we think of this through a public health lens, what we need to do is deploy these ideas into a much bigger group of people who have caring relationships with others to figure out how we can use these ideas, which is finally what John beat my door down on, to talk about what are the implications for this in terms of workforce. And as we've been testing these conversations around workforce development issues, this seems to be resonating. So that can be one of the conversations that you'll have when we go into the work group. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of the studies that we've done. This first one still is an active study, but we're actually doing this work in early learning settings where we're training people to be able to utilize the concepts of trauma to improve early childhood education outcomes. And in the course of doing this, because of the nature of this particular funding, we were actually training Head Start staff in Spokane to be able to deliver trauma-informed services. We had to actually introduce screening for trauma into the work so we could determine eligibility to come into the intervention. At this point, we've actually ended up having voluntary screenings done with nearly 1,100 families. The way we do this work is we end up having the social service staff that work with the family introduce the idea, explain why, as a system, Head Start is interested in the issue of trauma, and then invite them to participate. So I'm going to hit a couple of nuggets in an hour about things to pay attention to. You never take choice away from anybody. So if you have the ability to offer choice, you make things voluntary. And what we found is that when we did this, we have almost a 90% voluntary consent rate in terms of the people who have agreed to participate in this. So context matters. If you explain why this is important, if you explain how you're responsibly going to be able to use the information, you can open this conversation in a meaningful fashion. But in my community, here's what we found. 50% of the parents said that when they were growing up, 4 or more of these adverse childhood experiences happened to them. And when we then asked them about their 3 and 4-year-olds, they say, talking about their own children, that 1 in 4 of the children being served in Head Start in Spokane ended up already experiencing 4 or more ACEs. So these, again, 3 and 4-year-olds. One of the things we know from the broader literature is that this pattern is established very, very early in life. And critically, it's established before language is there to help make sense of what's happened to you. So you don't escape or make meaning out of chaos when you're 3 years old. You survive chaos. And this sets up a fundamental biological foundation for how it is that we need to talk about adversity and trauma. The chart that I've got up here is looking at teachers' ratings of school readiness on the currently the most widely employed teacher rating system being used in early learning in the United States. So this is independent from the parents' report of the adversity of their children. And what we're ending up seeing is that with 4 or more ACEs, those 1 in 4 kids, they are rated, in this case, on the issue of literacy, pre-literacy skills. They're rated significantly lower as they enter the program. That's the time one measured. And then about a year later, after they've been in the program, we're not showing gains. This, in 3 and 4-year-olds, it's a persisting kind of result. So, as a huge fan of Head Start, the implications are that the intervention that Head Start is using currently is not the intervention that's going to actually lead to gains based on this initial finding. And I'll do the disclaimer always on a single study and the need to validate in terms of this work. As children's ACEs increase, teachers' assessment of school readiness goes down. Why for a workforce group does this matter for you? When the young adults that you work reach you, this is the history that they've been bringing with them. This is the cumulative body of experiences that they've had. I know that not everybody comes into a workforce program because of the failures that they've experienced before, but a significant percentage of the folks that you work with come with this kind of history. And in the face of that, then what do we do? And how do we actually still work about this issue of repair when we're seeing things that have been established so early in life? Second study, just very quickly, this work we did here in Spokane. We did it with 10 elementary schools. We randomly selected 2,100 kids out of these K-6 groups. And the way that we approached this was not to go to the kids and not to go to the parents. What we did is we talked to the educators. And our premise was that educators get to hold a whole lot of information about the kids that they serve. One of the things I'm very interested in the conversation with all of you about workforce and the implications of this idea, is that equally true for you? Do you get to that level of intimacy that you actually know the history that your clients are bringing with them? But the way we approached it was the ACEs questions that I had shown you before, we had the educators complete that for what they factually knew. And we knew this was going to be a conservative approach to being able to get to estimates. What we learned was that in Spokane, that 1 in 10 kids in our elementary schools were already known to have experienced 3 or more ACEs. That 1 in 5 were known to have already experienced 2 or more ACEs. So again, this issue of, this is not a discussion about things at the margins. It's the central nature of the institutions that we depend on for the quality of life of our communities. We then crosswalked this through the schools on the issue of, is this a child who's already in trouble academically? And we defined that as not being able to meet grade level expectations in math and or reading for academic failure. And this is an odds chart. So the way you read an odds chart is you go to the bottom where you set the value as equal to 1. And that's no known ACEs, and then you look at is there progressive increase? And this is after we had controlled for poverty level, gender, age, the school, the teacher, whole variety of different things looked at. So with 3 or more ACEs in this study, what we're seeing is 3 times the rate of academic failure after we've accounted for everything else that we could look at within this community. For severe attendance problems with 3 or more ACEs, it's 5 times as likely, 6 times as likely for school behavior problems, 4 times as likely for poor reported health in elementary age kids. Let me tell you why we did this study, because actually we're an intervention group and this was not the principal thing that we were looking to do. But I live in a very conservative town, and we started to get very concerned that we were going to start to draw some concerns about our focus on this issue of trauma in what is kind of a 3 R's kind of community to a significant degree. And we wanted to be able to essentially make the business case that this is an existential problem for schools, that this becomes a powerful explanatory tool for why it is that kids are not being able to come out of our schools prepared to be able to enter the workforce and prosper and take care of their communities as we would hope they were going to do. So, having completely depressed you on the basis of that news, I'd like to actually switch and begin to talk about why there's absolutely reason that we should have hope in terms of this conversation. I'm going to start to do this, I need to introduce the term complex trauma. So complex trauma is actually a mental health treatment term. It's been around for 30, 35 years. It developed largely independently from the research that developed the ACEs research. And its origins actually came out of work in post-traumatic stress disorder. And particularly in the early 90s, what we ended up having as they did the reauthorization through the American Psychiatric Association of the diagnosis of PTSD. By that point, we had already had well-established PTSD treatments. But what we were seeing is that about a third of people were not being able to show benefit in terms of their ability to receive relief from the what were evidence-based treatments for PTSD. One of the absolutely dominant characteristics of those who did not benefit was the level of adversity that they experienced in childhood. So our focus on the issue of adversity in the lives of adults, again, has to be filtered through understanding what the history that they had as children. So complex trauma is this idea of early exposure at times of critical development, being exposed to multiple risks, that's the ACEs. And it has as its hallmark, as we think about what it is that this experience is that stress is unpredictable, but it's persistent. So the term that's part of this conversation nationally now is the idea of toxic stress. So toxic stress is this issue of, stress that wears you out. This is stress that exhausts you. And its characteristic is that those kinds of stress conditions are not continuous. They tend to be episodic, so they're this persistent, but they're unpredictable. So a story that I'll often use when I talk about this is from a colleague of mine who had a family in treatment. They lived in a fairly rural part of Spokane County, up a long gravel road. And as every work night, the 5 and 8-year-old kids in that house would sit in the living room, and what they were listening for was their dad coming home. And specifically what they were listening for was how hard was the gravel hitting the underside of his truck. And when it hit a certain volume, they went out the back window and into the woods until their mom came and told them that it was okay. Now, they loved their dad. They loved their dad. But their dad was not automatically a safe person. So what they lived with was this persistent but unpredictable level of chaos that operated in their lives. And it's that predictable but inconsistent experience that is one of the hallmarks of what adversity does. Adversity steals an essential sense of safety. And it steals it as a basic biological experience. So we have a tendency to want to bias towards thinking here where we need to be thinking here in terms of how we talk about these issues. This who you love is maybe who you can't trust is a reality in this conversation, but it's also a real trap because what it can lead us to do is to want to blame parents. And what we actually know is that parents who have been through these situations overwhelmingly love their children, are trying to do the best that they can with the circumstances they have, and overwhelmingly went through exactly the same kind of childhood that they're now trying to struggle for their kids to some sort of better place. Spent a good portion of my career working around child maltreatment issues. I can tell you, I can count on one hand the parents that I've worked with who didn't love their children. So even in the most difficult sets of circumstances, people continue to try to do the best that they can. But circumstances can overwhelm, bad decisions can complicate. The iceberg image is an important one in talking about this because we've been trained to look a lot at external behavior. And much like Eldar was talking about the issue of context and meaning and how it ends up getting created, what we need to do is we need to look underneath. We have to start thinking about what is the source of the behavior, not just the external conditions. So we end up looking at mapping complex trauma's risk. And again, the way to think about this, so I'm not confusing on language, ACEs describes the public health problem. ACEs is an extraordinary call to action. If it's 1 in 3 of us, if you will accept that statement from me, then you can't unhear that. You can't be in your neighborhood and not think about the implications associated with this. But what ACEs is an extraordinary call to action, but it doesn't tell us what to do. So the reason we've shifted, and we talk through this lens of trauma, is that because we've been treating trauma for a long time, we actually know what good practice looks like. We know what good practice principles are, and we think that they are translatable into different settings. So when we end up looking at this, one of the hallmarks of growing up in significant adversity is that you're much more likely to have impaired relationships. It's tough for you to be able to get along with your boss. It's tough for you to be able to manage your way through your relationships with coworkers. You blow up at your instructor in your GED class. And you get washed out because your behavior is scary and inexplicable. And at that point, you're being cut off from one of the major resources and tools you have to get to a better life. This is involved with social emotional development being really put at risk. So you have 24-year-olds going on 4 in terms of their emotional reaction. If you've ever hung out around schools, we have 4-year-olds who are going on 24 in terms of their ability to be able to manage a lot of the demands. But this issue of this uneven kind of development is one of the hallmarks of people who have lived with significant trauma. And at its heart, it's a problem about emotional regulation. So I'm going to kind of come back to that because that we think actually is a place where we can pivot, and people in all sorts of relationships with others can start to understand and utilize that as a tool. I'll come back on that as a point. Biologically, what we're looking at is that the parts of our brain that actually manage the recognition and response to threat, to danger, has been rewired from what would have been optimal. So we end up actually, if you think of a thermostat with this, is that the thermostat is faulty, and we distort, overreact, misinterpret lots of situations as being very, very dangerous. If we don't have that history ourselves, it becomes very puzzling to understand why it is somebody's reacting the way that they are. But that this idea of thinking of this, that the ability to realistically understand safety and understand threat has been distorted. We find that's been a very practical term. Concept of dissociation is a psychological term. It's basically cutting yourself off from your feelings. So somebody who has a dissociative kind of an experience might say to you, I feel like I experience the world as a TV show. So there's actually almost this kind of pane of glass phenomenon that they can end up describing. But a lot of it is, the key kind of concept there is this disconnection of your ability to accurately read your own emotional state in order to be able to understand and have better choices in the situation. If we can't read our own emotional state well, we're usually really bad at being able to read the emotional conditions of others, which again flows back into this issue of distortion, miscuing, and the relational kinds of problems that we end up seeing. What we know is that the risk that you're actually going to see cognitive development problems, much like Eldar was talking about, this ability to have persistence and attentional kinds of concerns, that these things are compromised. And again, the health risk that we talked about. Let me explain the picture, because I want to make a point in terms of the story. One of the programs we ran in Spokane for about 5 years was an alliance with law enforcement. And what we did is we went to every roll call for sheriff and police department in the county for about a 2-month period, and we trained them about recognition and understanding about trauma. And then what we did is we asked them to basically bring inside themselves a script, and the script would be the following when they responded to a family where violence had occurred and a young child was in the home. And the script was, I know typically to the mom, but not always, I know this must have been very difficult for you and that you're very concerned for your children. I'm working with some people who might be able to help you. Would it be okay if I called them and then give you the phone? So what we did was a 24/7 hot response. We ended up seeing about 1,100 families, about 1,400 kids under the age of 5. That was, again, set by our funding, that we had to be kind of targeted for how we did the look. We went into this program and ended up confirming something as a community we're very concerned about, which was that we didn't think that we were actually seeing the violence that was happening in our community, that this was out of our line of sight, and that was making it more complex and difficult for us to be able to get to these issues. We confirmed this. Of the nearly 1,100 families that we ended up seeing, less than 20% of them were known to any treatment system of any kind. These folks were completely off the net, under the radar. And the kinds of situations we were responding into were horrific. There were about 80% of these were very serious violent, intimate partner violence exchanges. We responded to 5 homicides, 3 children being killed in our community. So these were big ticket issues, and even when that was the case, it was a 10 to 20 minute encounter with police, and then it was out of our line of sight again. So part of this conversation, what I want to really stress with this, is that we carry a personal responsibility, and the personal responsibility is to step up. So the whatever it takes starts with the issue of us talking to each other about these issues, us equipping ourselves with some basic facts and not being silent in the face of what it is that we're facing. What this picture ends up, this is a little boy, about 4.5, who ended up drawing this picture. And down in the lower left-hand corner, what he was saying as he was drawing it is that this is a stepdad with big head and blood. So why do we do pictures with very young kids? You can't use language as a therapeutic tool, but you can use art as a way to be able to connect and work with them. So where do we go in terms of trying to actually deal with these issues? What we end up seeing is that there are 4 places where we can really end up setting some very basic goals. And these are things that we can start the conversation in any of our groups now about how we deal with this. The first one is we have to pay attention to the issue of physical safety. If what trauma does is steal safety, then for us as organizations, we have it's incumbent on us to actually start to intentionally design our environments to offset these issues. So the program supports predictable and safe environments. In schools, roughly 4 out of 10 kids will end up saying that they're afraid to go into the bathrooms in their schools because they're afraid of the bullying and assault that may happen. That's pretty much cross-community kind of an approach. We have to focus on issues of emotional safety. Program environment fosters trust and emphasizes authenticity. We need to work on the issue of understanding predictability. So the core concept around predictability as it relates to this issue of trauma is that when things become uncertain for me, my default position is to believe that I'm in danger, that any kind of change is potentially an opportunity for threat. Again, hardwired, I'll come back in a moment and kind of talk about some of the structures that are associated with this, but it puts this issue on, we need to actually be intentional about the predictability that we end up working with. One of the exercises we'll do when we're working, particularly in elementary schools, is we'll put folks together at tables in grade level teams, and we'll say, how many transitions in a typical day do you ask kids to be able to manage? And usually after about 15 minutes, they're at 35 transitions and they have not reached lunch. So why are transitions so important? Transitions involve a shift in activity, a shift in environment, a shift in relationship. And any change is coded potentially as dangerous, and it's an opportunity to lose control over the choices that you end up having. So almost all disciplinary concerns in schools happen at points of transition. So the smarter we are about being able to actually manage our social environment so that we are using transitions as they're necessary, not because it's how we've always done things, creates the opportunity to actually begin to shift these conversations. And we need to work on consistency. So we need to work on the issue that Not just that I am consistent with what I deal with, but if you're my colleague, that you and I send the same message, we operate from the same values, we use the same language. And that then means that this is a collective responsibility. So taking this conversation and what I'll be pivoting to in terms of major recommendation is that we tend to think of the client, the student, the patient as the focus of change. And the argument I want to give you, we're the focus of change. We're the ones who can shift this, and that by shifting it, we create better opportunity for others. Again, very short introductory presentation today, but I'm going to highlight some issues. One of the arguments is, again, we tend to see this through the psychology, and I'm going to argue that the distinction between psychology and biology is nonsensical. We are integrated human beings in terms of how it is that we respond. These are 4 principles that are well established in science. These are not mine. They're actually from a guy named Bruce Perry, who's well known in this field. And the first one is that our brains are designed to benefit from rich and supportive intimate social relationships. And that's as true for an infant as it is true for each of us in this room. We depend on each other to organize ourselves. If you've ever been truly alone, if you've had long periods of time by yourself, you get a little odd. Because we're built to, now look at your neighbor and see how odd they might be. We depend on the ability to be in continuous connection for the validation, the feedback, the organizing principles. The second is that brain function is hierarchical, and this is, again, it's a challenge. So my training as a psychologist is I was trained very much in cognitive behavioral perspective, and this inverted most of my training because I was taught to focus on the thought to control, to actually be able to get better control over behavior. And what the principle here biologically is that thinking is the last thing we do, not the first thing that we do. We feel and then we think. And that understanding that is a powerful tool because it allows us to be able to organize how it is that we read people, how we organize our environments, and how we choose to organize ourselves. Brain development is also use dependent, so that the structures and functions in the brain actually can be demonstrated that if you spend your life trying to deal with the issue of uncertainty, it will shift your brain structure. Here's the 4th principle and why there's every reason for hope. What we know now is that the brain can recode at any age and restructure at any age. It is a lot easier to do this when you're little, but it is still hopeful at any age. So one of the things that we do when we go into schools, so I'll take this as a moment to briefly describe. We actually do 3-year intervention programs. And the programs that we do in schools, we are here in Seattle, we're at West Seattle Elementary, which has been a wonderful host as a school. We're in our 2nd year there. And what we end up doing as one of the things that we'll end up doing in this program is we do a very strong and scripted professional development program where we unpack these principles over about a 2-year period, and we do it in 1-hour increments once a month. This is not what we set out to do. It was the cards we were handed when we launched because all training days for educators in the state of Washington were lost about 6 years ago. Gone. Unlikely they're coming back. So when we went to our school partners and said, what can you give us in terms of being able to do the professional development necessary to do this work, they said we can give you 1 hour a month. So what we do is a very scripted, choreographed process. It does take about 2 years, but what we actually do with professional development is it's a pivot to coaching. So we put our trauma team staff into a building 2 days a month. And what we're looking to do is to build the context, the organizational structure, to actually start to work with people that they begin to shift their own environment. And our job is to be coaches to that as a process. But in doing this, to this issue of brain development, one of the things we'll do is we go in and we start in kindergarten and we teach the brain. And we'll model it to teachers so that they can adopt this. We crosswalk it to the biology lessons appropriate to the grade level so that we're able to deal with this. This is the group participatory part of my conversation with you. So if you choose, raise your right hand. I'm not going to swear you to anything, I promise. Okay, roll your thumb in, bring your hands over. This is the spinal column. This is midbrain structures that primarily control emotions. This is cognition. This is cortex. This is where our cognitive process is. This is actually work of a guy named Siegel, Daniel Siegel. But he talks about upstairs brain and downstairs brain. And the idea is under stress. This is the hierarchical nature of behavior, is that under stress, what we do is we flip our lids. Why is that important? Well, because it becomes an explanatory tool for why it is that we're seeing behavior. And what we found is that kids as young as 5 can understand this and actually will end up using this as a way of being able to talk about their own experience. The critical issue here is how feelings can overwhelm our best intentions and our choices. And that when we are under stress, we lose the ability to regulate so that our brain is a whole organ operating, and we get more and more basic the more and more stressed we are. So that we end up having experiences. For teachers, this can be quite profound. For educators like you in workforce, this can be quite profound. If you have somebody in one of your programs who is highly, highly agitated, the chances are very good that the parts of their brain that can actually understand what you're saying to them in that moment is shut off, cut off, not available to them. Because what we know biologically is under high levels of stress, high levels of emotion, actually we end up seeing that the connections between the midbrain structures that control emotion and the prefrontal cortex that controls a lot of intention, choice, moral decision making actually get cut off in the moment. So emotion dominates, the ability to make decisions and choices get overwhelmed in that situation. That's a very practical tool for a teacher, because it says that the first thing that I need to do is not talk louder and more slowly, but to actually make the goal being, how do I help this person calm and be more receptive and ready to be with me in the moment? So a lot of the coaching, as an example with that, is how do you do that with an individual child? How do you individualize to the need of that child? And how do you do that in terms of classroom management practices? So if you take from this, the major thing that I want to stress is that we need to recognize that what we're doing is we're fighting the issue about shifting the biological foundation of behavior that is established as a consequence of adversity, that there's reasons to hope, but this is not an easy piece of work to take on. So this chart is looking at CAT scans of a normally developing 4-year-old and one of the Romanian orphans, if you remember the tragedy that happened in Romania. Where there's brighter color, there's more brain activity. So you can get a visual check very, very quickly with this. But actually, I use the slide because I want to point out where the circles are and where you see in those circles the difference in activities. Those are the temporal lobes. And what the temporal lobes are critically involved with is the ability to process language, make sense out of things, but the critical role that they play in encoding memory. So when we start to think about the thing that we all share in this room is that we're in the business of trying to create conditions where people are able to prosper because they have new information and new skills. That's a memory issue, that this is an encoding of understanding within this. So we end up saying that we can demonstrate that in this granted example, an extreme instance, we can actually demonstrate that this is straight down into the biological structure of the brain. So what's the cycle that we're dealing with? Start in the upper right-hand quadrant here, that what trauma does is it steals an essential sense of safety. Adversity steals safety. And what this leads to is a fairly pervasive assumption about danger. Now, again, as we break into the work group, I would tell you, I would argue that that's a definition of scarcity in another lens. as we're ending up looking at this. This leads to physiological and behavioral responses that can be organized primarily around safety seeking and need fulfillment. And I'll come back and talk briefly about that. But at this point, survival trumps learning. And what it does is it distorts and it takes you off your developmental trajectory, because this becomes about survival, not about the issue of growth. Critical tool, again, I've talked about this, but I just want to highlight, is this threat arousal axis. So the first response we have to any change is emotional. If you're trauma exposed, the first emotional response is going to be one of being unsafe, and that this becomes an immediate dominating reaction that organizes your behavior. Trauma results in these distortions, that learned responses of fear that are not matched to the objective reality, heightened arousal as a trait, so we can think of hyper arousal and impulsivity, and I'll toss this particular grenade into the room. ADHD is a real thing. ADHD, in my opinion, often is misdiagnosed trauma. And that what we end up doing is we end up putting a label that's a psychiatric label onto somebody who is actually a survivor and has figured out how to be able to cope in a variety of different circumstances. So understanding this assumption of danger, the tool here to work with and understand is the issue of triggers. So perception of a lack of power, unexpected changes and transitions. Need fulfillment, emotional relationships, mastery. And I really want to stress this. There is an inherent characteristic in human beings to master our environment, to be better. I have my first grandchild, and I watch this on a day-to-day process with her. To be better, to grow, to change is inherently how we're built. So that need doesn't go away, but it does get distorted, and it gets distorted through this lens of being unsafe. So we get into a lot of power struggles that are about what are reasonable rules for us that are being interpreted as you're essentially challenging my ability to have choice. And that's the fight that I'm about to have with you. Recognizing that then shifts and takes away some of the sting and some of the affect from the conflict that you're dealing with. From this slide, we have to, the critical tool is we've got to shift from thinking about our clients and our patients as the focus of change, and we have to think about ourselves and our relationships as the focus of change. If you want to help someone get into better control of their own emotional state, change yours. That the art of this is actually being able to recognize and then modify. I worked in patient psychiatry for a period of my career. Here's what chronic schizophrenics taught me to do. They taught me to sit down when I talk to them. Because of my size, I can be physically intimidating. And what I learned I had to do was actually shift that dynamic. That's an example of I modify in order to co-regulate in the situation. So what are the components for recovering? We have to interrupt continuing trauma, and this is a terrible challenge because we go to bystander mode very, very easily as we have news. I'd actually challenge us as communities to argue that that silence is a sin. That we have a responsibility when we know what's going on to actually say something and to try to do what we can. We have to ask ourselves, do we operate in systems where we are traumatizing? And most people who work in education will tell you that too often schools are traumatizing environments, and that the programs and the punitive nature with how we end up dealing with compliance issues, as an example, become opportunities to reemphasize. And then finally, what we need to do is we need to focus on the issue of resilience, because ACEs and resulting trauma are only half the story. And I'll argue it's the least interesting thing I can know about you. What I want to know is who loved you, who gave you opportunity, who was patient with you when patience was needed, because resilience is inherently a relational set of resources that we have. It's a bank account. We can build it up and we can spend it down. So that our ability to actually have resilience building relationships and the kinds of programs you work in become critical. So what do we mean by these? It's one of my favorite pictures, by the way. We need to teach coping skills because they didn't come naturally. We need to build relationship resources and skills. We have to help create a legitimate sense of efficacy, not an overinflated sense of self-esteem, but efficacy is the belief that I can do something and I've earned the right to believe that. We have to have a realistic but positive sense of self, and we have to work towards creating the ability to experience happiness. We learn more effectively through joy than through any other mechanism that we have. So belief, skills, environment are all tools that we can begin to use to take these ideas forward for how we deal with these things. How do you get started? Well, if this was a new conversation for you, you can't undo being trauma aware, but you also then have to move to being trauma sensitive, which is to look at its implications, to trauma informed, which is how does this start to shift your behavior. And trauma specific is for the percentage of people who need something more. They need more formal treatment, and that's part of the reality as we're dealing with these issues, is that there are folks who are may not be broken, but they have been changed. So let me stop with that, and thanks so much for the opportunity to be with you.